The city of Worcester presents Rec Rule Online.
Brought to you by the Division of Youth Opportunities.
This week for academics.
Hello students, my name is Denzel and welcome back to another episode of Rec Rule Online. I hope you all had a great week and I hope you're feeling rested and ready for a new learning experience. For the next 2 weeks, we'll be covering the topic of Afrofuturism and touching upon all the aspects of the word. Afrofuturism encompasses things like history, technology, and culture. This week, we're going to be focusing mainly on the history aspect of the word, and next week we'll dive deeper into the Afrofuturism part. To lay the backdrop for what Afrofuturism is, we must talk about the journey and the history that leads up to Afrofuturism and how it spread culture. The journey to Afrofuturism, I believe, starts with the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was the forced movement of African people from Africa into Western and European worlds. The transatlantic slave trade started in the 15th century and lasted to the beginning of the 19th century. During these 4 centuries, about 15 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. During the Middle Passage phase, that was the journey on the Atlantic Ocean between Africa and the Western/European worlds, about 2 million enslaved Africans died from a multitude of causes. During this Middle Passage phase, it was common for deceased African slaves to be thrown overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. It was actually so common that it shifted migratory patterns of sharks and other ocean predators. Disclaimer, I mentioned this not to be grotesque, but because this is a theme that is often revisited in various Afrofuturistic works. For the enslaved Africans who made it to the Western world and were able to survive, they thrived. They were able to blend cultural practices they had brought with them with the ones that existed in the lands that they were brought to. This led to the African diaspora. The definition of diaspora is the dispersion of any people from their original homeland. But in this context, we're using this to describe the spread of African people outside of Africa to different continents and nations. This is where my lesson ends for the week, but Selenam and Eunice are going to be discussing more in depth the spread and the mixing of cultures in the Western world that happened because of slavery. Alright, so now here's a quick review of the terms used today. The first term is transatlantic slave trade. And the transatlantic slave trade was the forced movement and enslavement of African people to the Western and European worlds. The next term is Middle Passage. Middle Passage was the forced journey that enslaved Africans were taken on between the Western world, Europe, and Africa. And the final term used today is diaspora. The definition of diaspora is the dispersion of any group of people from their original homeland. In this context, we're using it to describe the enslaved Africans. Alright, so that concludes my lesson for this week. I hope you guys tune in for the rest of this lesson next week.
Hi guys, now that Denzel has discussed the history of slavery and the Middle Passage, I'm going to take over and discuss the cultural influences that emerged from Africa to the United States, specifically focusing on the Gullah Geechee ethnic group in South Carolina and the Caribbean island of Jamaica. So, the Gullah Geechee people are African Americans who can be found in the South Carolina Low Country, which includes both the coastal plain and the Beaufort Sea Islands. They can be found in parts of Georgia and Florida as well. So the Gullah Geechee were known for preserving their African and linguistic cultural heritage more than any group of African Americans in the US. They spoke their own English-based Creole, they adopted words from African languages, and had their own music. They also had their own cuisine and farming and fishing traditions, which were all strong influences from West Africa. Interesting, right? So if y'all didn't know, Charleston, South Carolina is one of the major ports that the slaves in the South first got to the US. Most of these slaves were from the West African rice coast of Sierra Leone and Senegal. So after slavery ended, the African slaves in Beaufort Islands in South Carolina developed their own community and became the Gullah Geechee people. And so, after the Civil War ended, the Gullah Geechee's isolation from the rest of the world increased, and the Gullah Geechee people were left alone in remote rural areas in South Carolina and continue to practice their traditional culture, which is still present today. In recent years, the Gullah people have been persistent in keeping control of their traditional lands. And so some of their recent accomplishments within the community includes, the U.S. Congress has passed the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Act, providing $10 million over 10 years for the preservation and interpretation of historic sites relating to Gullah culture. The Gullah also organize festivals every year in towns near the Low Country, and now academics like historians are now very interested in their rich cultural heritage, and books have even been published about them, and they've become a symbol of cultural pride for Black people throughout the US. So now we're going to be talking about the Caribbean island of Jamaica and its maroon people. So if you guys don't know, Jamaican ancestors, also known as the Maroons, came from Africa through slavery, and many of the enslaved Africans continue to practice the beliefs and traditions that they knew. So the Maroons have been identified as Coromantis slaves purchased from the Akan region of West Africa, which is presently known as Ghana. So among the Maroons and the people brought to Jamaica as slaves in general, the Akan cultural influences predominated. So now let's talk about the language. So the language of the Maroons was Jamaican Patois, locally known as Patois, and Jamaican Creole. So it's an English-based Creole language with West African influences, with the majority of loan words of Akan origin, spoken mainly in Jamaica and among the Jamaican diaspora. So now we can also find extensive Akan influence on the Maroons and Jamaicans of African origin, generally by looking at naming patterns. These patterns reveal the extent to which concepts of family, lineage, and kinship were retained beyond the Atlantic crossing. So it's also been found that many of the names used by the Maroons and even descendants of slaves today come from Africa. One of the most recognizable African naming patterns in both North America and the Caribbean is the West African custom of day names. So this means that each day was assigned a particular name, and a baby was named according to which day of the week he or she was born. So Akan day names predominated among the Maroons and other African people of Jamaica. So for example, a baby born on Sunday was named Kwesi in Ghana and Kwashi in Jamaica. So these names carry specific connotations. So both female and male names for each day had a different meaning. So for instance, the Monday male name Kujo means strong-headed, and the female version means clever. So other links between the culture of Jamaicans and Africans include their music instruments. So the music played and the instruments used by the slaves of Jamaica were similar to African music, and these include the Central African lute and the 8-string harp, which is also a Coromanti instrument. And lastly, have you guys heard of the Rastafaris? So Rastafari is also known as Rastafarianism, and it's a religion or a way of life that developed in Jamaica during the 1930s. So they are popularly known to keep long dreadlocks, as you guys have probably seen. And they accord Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia between the 1930s. They regarded him as the second coming of Christ. And Rastafari is also really Afrocentric and focuses a lot of its attention on the African diaspora. So as we know now, there are so many African cultural influences that emerged from slavery.
So Solomon talked about the cultural influence in the United States and Caribbean, and I will continue to speak on the cultural influence in South America, specifically in Brazil, Mexico, and San Balesto de Plaque, Colombia. Many people are not aware that in South America there's a huge population of African descent, especially in Mexico. The ship did not only stop in South Carolina or in the Caribbean islands. It actually traveled their way to the south, known as South America. Let's start with Mexico. So where specifically are they located in Mexico? Well, you'll find them in Costa Chica and Huateca and Guerrero, Veracruz, and some parts of the city in northern Mexico. Spanish authorities rule Mexico since the 1600s, and they were responsible for the migration of more than 200,000 enslaved Africans. However, on their way to Veracruz, Huateca, and Guerrero, many have died due to the poor conditions on the ships. There was a huge African descent population up till the 1810. Then there was a decline. However, the Spanish authorities managed to import more slaves in the early 1800s from Cuba during the colonial period. So the slaves were taken to different industries across Mexico, but eventually they were fed up with the abuse and found a way to escape somewhere in the mountains or remote area for liberation. Although African descents were stripped away from their own culture, country, and family, they contributed to the economic growth. Unfortunately, their contribution is invisible till this day, and no one acknowledges their existence due to their race, the color of their skin. They were and still are a huge influence to the culture that they in Mexico. So I would suggest you all to type in Afro Mexico in the Google search box, and you'll receive more history and a video of the people there to speak about their experiences. History continues in another part of the country in South America called Salvador de Bahia, Brazil. So in the 1500s, Portuguese explorers landed in the region called Bahia and came across a large indigenous populations whom they traded wood, food, etc. Portugal and other European nations were in competition to winning over that section of Brazil, but Portugal won it from the technology of sugar plantation. By the 1600s, it was known to be the largest exporter of sugar for Europe. So they exploited the indigenous people to work on their sugar plantation, but later on they imported slaves to work on their plantations. So indigenous were working, but then they decided to bring the African people to Brazil. So Brazil were receiving slaves from all continents, landing about 5 million. About 5 million they had before slavery ended in 1888. 90% of Africans who arrived were mostly from Bight of Benin or Central Africa. So due to the strong cultural connection between Bahia and Africa, in the early 19th century, they built a religious institution and social hierarchy. In the late 18th century, they received a large population of Muslim and eventually practiced Islam, but wasn't successful along the way. So still to this day, there's still people from Africa who still live there, or have from the African descent who lives in Brazil. I just wanted to really highlight that the information that I briefly gave you is a start for you all to continue to be curious and learn the truth about history, especially among the African or just Black communities in America, in all Americas, from north to south. Until this day, many African or Black people are still disfranchised. Some may say we have come a long way, but for some reason they end up still on the news, either dead or in prison. I also want to point out that it is important to recognize that African people are not just in Africa, they are mostly in all parts of the world because of the enslavement that was caused by a European nation. I hope this was able to enlighten you to continue learning more. I'm going to continue speaking specifically and briefly about the enslavement in San Bernardo de Plaque, Colombia. San Bernardo is a small village in the foothills of Montes de Maria in the south of Cartagena in Colombia. Plaquete was founded in the 16th century by Bencos Bayojo, an African king that was sold into slavery, however managed to escape around 1599. During his escape, he formed an army of men to conquer the section of the village around Montes de Maria. Bojos was able to create a network of intelligence that helped him continue to free slaves. So around 1605, the governor of Cartagena offered Bojos a piece of treaty. The treaty was finalized in 1612, but the Spanish authorities violated that in the 1619 when they captured Bojos and hung him. Years later, in 1691, the Spanish crown offered a royal decree from officially freeing the slaves and making San Bernardo de Plaque the first free slave settlements in Americas. Again, ripped away from their own country, they still embrace and maintain their African oral and musical traditions, especially the Spanish batu, spoken on earth, known as plaquero. They express themselves through singing, drumming, and known to sell coconut sweets. And their history continues across South America.
Hello, Worcester. My name is Raquel Castro-Corazzini, and I'm the Director of the Division of Youth Opportunities. In order for us to post photos or videos of your creations and activities, we need a parent or guardian to submit a photo release form found on the Recreation Worcester website on the City of Worcester's website, www.worcesterma.gov/Recreation Worcester. Photo and video releases are meant to protect your family's privacy. You can still submit your work, and we will edit out any faces that do not include a photo release. You only have to fill it out once and can change your mind at any time. Just contact us with any changes and we will update your permissions. We look forward to highlighting all the projects submitted. Thank you and stay safe.
Share your pictures or videos of your final project with us by texting us at 774-366-5103.
Or email them to us at calixtov@worcesterma.gov.
Or message us on Facebook or Instagram.
Did you have fun today? Have fun and stay safe. See you next time.